Imagine the buzz of the stage lights so loud that it seems to drown out all other sounds. Imagine the rough fabric of the uniform rubbing against your skin, a constant distraction. Now imagine being in the middle of dozens of voices, but feeling completely alone, invisible. This is exactly where our story begins, in the deafening silence of being ignored. Before we find out what happened on that stage, tell me where in the world you are joining us today. The story you are about to hear is about a young man whom the world decided not to listen to until his voice became impossible to ignore, causing an avalanche of emotions that no one expected. Subscribe now, because this is one of those stories that reminds us that the greatest talents often flourish in the shadows. For Isabel, Leo's mother, the door to the school auditorium was a boundary between hope and pain. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would sit in the back, in one of the dusty velvet chairs, and watch. She didn't watch the choir as a whole, but only him, her son, Leo, 16 years old, standing in the back row, a little apart from the others. He loved music more than anything in the world. At home, music was his language, his refuge. He didn't just listen to songs, he felt them, dissected them, breathed them. Singing in the school choir was his biggest dream. But to the conductor, Mr. Dubois, Leo was little more than a piece out of place in his perfect arrangement. Isabel saw her son's gaze, full of expectation, waiting for a nod, for an instruction, for the slightest recognition that never came. She saw how the conductor passed by him, his eyes scanning the row and stopping on everyone but him. Leo was never out of tune. His pitch was mathematically perfect. But he didn't sway to the rhythm like the others, he didn't socialize during breaks. He stood still, absorbing the music, living it from within. And this stillness, this contained intensity, was mistaken for disinterest. Isabel's outburst was not made up of screams, but of a painful silence in the car on the way home. It was the question she asked herself every night, watching her son sleep. What do I do? She saw the sparkle in Leo's eyes diminish with each rehearsal. The passion that drove him was slowly being erased by indifference. Her pain was the pain of seeing the world trying to convince her son that his greatest passion, his purest joy, was worthless. It was the pain of knowing that he had a galaxy of sounds inside him, but no one bothered to offer him a telescope. She felt complicit in this silent torture, for continuing to take him to a place that hurt him, just because he loved it too much to give up. Moved by a mixture of despair and maternal love, Isabel decided she could no longer be a silent spectator to this emotional massacre. She scheduled a meeting with Mr. Dubois. The meeting took place in a small music room, crammed with sheet music and instruments, which smelled of old wood and dust. The conductor, a middle-aged man with a tired look and shoulders hunched under the weight of his own frustrated ambitions, listened to her with a patience that bordered on condescension. "Mrs. Blanchard," he began, adjusting his glasses, "I appreciate your concern, but the choir is a collective organism. It requires a certain synchronicity. It's not just about the voice, it's about the performance, the expression. Leo is a good boy, very quiet, but he seems distant." Isabel tried to explain. She talked about Leo's hyperfocus, about how his apparent aloofness was actually the deepest concentration. She talked about how music was his way of connecting with the world. Mr. Dubois smiled, a weak, empty smile. "I'll keep an eye on him," he promised. But it was an empty promise, and Isabel knew it. It was a polite way of saying, "Don't bother me." The false hope continued in a conversation with the school principal. He was nice, used words like inclusion and potential, but the practical solution he offered was a punch in the gut for Isabel. Maybe competitive choir isn't the right environment for him. Have you considered private music lessons? Something more controlled? They didn't see the problem with exclusion. They saw the problem in Leo. They wanted to cut him down to fit into their box instead of widening the box so he could grow. Every attempt to seek help resulted in the same veiled message. Her son was the problem. The pain of indifference now added to the pain of invalidation. The hope that someone would see what she saw in Leo was fading like smoke, leaving only the bitter smell of resignation. The emotional strain began to create cracks within the home. Isabel's husband, Mark, a good, hard-working man, viewed his wife and son's suffering with a pragmatism that hurt. He wasn't cruel. but he was afraid of seeing Leo get hurt even more. "Isabel, you're torturing yourself, and you're torturing him," he said one night as she stared into space in the kitchen. "Maybe the principal is right. Why insist on a place where he's not welcome? You're creating an expectation that will end in heartbreak, ours and his." The conflict wasn't about love. It was about how to love. Isabel wanted to fight for a place for her son in the world as he was. Mark wanted to protect his son from the world by molding him so he would suffer less. It was the eternal battle between acceptance and adaptation, and that battle was raging right in the middle of their living room. And Mr. Dubois? It would be easy to paint him as a villain, but the truth was more complex and therefore sadder. He wasn't a bad man. He was an exhausted man, a musician who dreamed of conducting orchestras in Paris or Vienna and ended up stuck in a high school choir, dealing with tight budgets, uninterested teenagers, and the constant pressure for trophies in regional competitions. He saw music as a rigid discipline, an architecture of perfect sounds. Leo's passion, expressed in his quietness and his unique way of connecting with the notes, was, for the conductor, a variable he didn't know how to fit into his equation. Leo's intensity was not something he could conduct or control. In his exhaustion and narrow view of art, he did not ignore Leo out of malice, but out of an inability to see beyond his own score, his own tired world. And that human flaw, that lack of curiosity, was what caused the deepest pain. The change didn't come with a big confrontation or a fiery speech. It arrived quietly, disguised as a minor administrative problem. With 2 weeks to go before the big end-of-year recital, the event for which Mr. Dubois was rehearsing the choir with almost military precision, the school received an unexpected invitation. A local church was organizing a community talent show, an event with no competition, no prizes, just for the joy of sharing art. One of the invited groups had canceled at the last minute, and they needed someone to fill 20 minutes in the program. The principal, thinking of promoting the school's image in the community, asked Mr. Dubois if the choir could participate. The conductor's first reaction was one of contempt. A non-competitive event? A waste of time. He was focused on the recital, on perfection, on the acclaim that would validate his work. But the principal insisted, and Mr. Dubois reluctantly agreed to take part of the choir to perform 2 or 3 songs. Then, in the midst of planning, a silent turning point occurred. One of the lead soloists, the star of the choir, fell ill and would not be able to sing at the church show. For the group songs, it wouldn't make a difference. But there was a short piece, a melancholy and little-known folk song, that depended on a solo voice. Mr. Dubois rolled his eyes in frustration. It wasn't worth rehearsing a replacement for such an insignificant event. He was about to cut the song from the program when his gaze, purely by chance, swept across the room and landed on Leo, quietly standing in his corner. And then, an idea popped into his weary mind. A pragmatic, almost cynical idea. Why not? He thought. The kid can sing. It's a short song. No one important will be watching. At least his mother will stop nagging me. And so, without any fanfare, without any expectations, he walked over to Leo. "Blanchard," he said, his voice as dry as ever. "Learn the solo part of Le Vent d'Hiver. You sing on Friday." He handed Leo the sheet music and turned away, without waiting for a response, without having the slightest idea that he had just handed him the key that would open a door to a universe he didn't even know existed. Mr. Dubois gave Leo the sheet music as if he were discarding an unimportant task. But for Leo, that piece of paper was the world. It was the first time he wasn't just part of the background, but the lead voice. In the following rehearsals, something began to change. Small things, almost imperceptible. The first small victory came in the first rehearsal of the song. Mr. Dubois asked Leo to sing his part, probably expecting a shy and dull performance. Leo began, and the other voices, which had been talking quietly, fell silent, one by one. The voice that came out of him wasn't loud, but it had a purity and control that no one there expected. There was a sadness in those notes, a depth that seemed to come from a very old place. The conductor himself, who was about to give a correction, stopped, his hand in the air, and just listened until the end. He said nothing, just "okay" again, but for the first time there was a hint of surprise in his voice. The second victory was with his colleagues. A small group that had previously ignored him now looked at him differently. One of the girls, after rehearsal, approached him and said simply, "You sing beautifully, Leo." It was 4 words, but to a boy who had lived in invisibility for so long, they sounded like a symphony. The greatest victory, however, was happening inside Leo himself. With every note he sang, a part of him that had been shrunk and frightened began to stretch and grow. Music was his armor and his weapon, his way of translating the chaos of the world into beauty. He didn't need to look at people. He didn't need to decipher facial expressions. He just needed to feel the music and let it out. The confidence that was born in him was not arrogant. It was calm, solid. It was the certainty that, in that space with that melody, he belonged. He was home. And that silent certainty was the most powerful of all victories. For Leo, music was never just sound. It was a complete sensory experience, a language he understood better than words. When he heard a melody, he didn't just hear notes. He saw colors, felt textures. The piano sounded like smooth, cold blocks of glass. The violin, like silk ribbons unfurling in the air. The voices of the choir were like strands of wool of different thicknesses, weaving a tapestry of sound. And his own voice? It was the color blue, a deep, calm blue, like the night sky just before dawn. While rehearsing Le Vent d'Hiver, the winter wind song, he didn't think about the audience, the conductor, or the pressure. He thought about the story the music told in his brain. He felt the chill of the wind, saw the snow falling in gray and silver flakes. The melancholy of the song was not sad to him. It was true. It was the color of loneliness, but not a bad loneliness. It was the loneliness of a winter landscape, vast, silent, and of a pure beauty. He reflected on how people communicated. They used so many words, but often said so little. Conversations were full of things left unsaid, of social rules he didn't understand. Why did people ask, "How are you?" if they didn't really want to know the answer? It was confusing. But music was different. Music was honest. A C major was always a C major. The harmony was either right or wrong. There was no room for lies. Being ignored by Mr. Dubois hurt him, but he didn't feel angry. He felt a kind of puzzle. He didn't understand why the conductor couldn't hear what he heard. It was as if Mr. Dubois saw the world in black and white, while Leo saw it in vibrant colors. And now, with that little song, he had a chance to show his colors. Not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to be himself, in the purest way he knew how. Singing was his way of saying to the world, "I'm here. This is me. This is my color." The church auditorium was modestly full. Parents, grandparents, friends. The atmosphere was that of a community event, polite but without great expectation. The school choir took the stage and sang 2 cheerful songs, receiving warm applause. Isabel and Mark were in the 4th row, holding hands, her heart beating wildly. Then Mr. Dubois turned to the audience. And now, a traditional folk song, with a solo by one of our members, Leo Blanchard. Leo stepped forward. The hum of the light seemed louder than ever. For a moment the world seemed to dissolve into white noise. He closed his eyes, and then he sang. The first note left his mouth and hung in the air. Pure, crystalline, perfect. The buzz of the audience ceased instantly. People who had been fiddling with their cell phones looked up. The sound that filled the space was not just technically perfect. It was charged with raw emotion, a vulnerability that was disarming. It was the voice of someone who understood loneliness, beauty, pain, and hope all at the same time. It was the sound of deep blue. Isabel felt tears streaming down her face without realizing it. Next to her, Mark, the practical and reserved man, squeezed her hand tightly, his eyes fixed on his son, completely paralyzed. In the audience, faces began to contort with emotion. A woman in the front row wiped her tears with a handkerchief. A man in a suit closed his eyes, as if in prayer. On stage, Mr. Dubois was frozen. He, who had spent months ignoring this boy, now watched him as if seeing him for the first time. He wasn't seeing a distant student. He was witnessing a force of nature, an art so pure that it defied all his technique, all his theory. When the last note faded into silence, there was a pause. A second of absolute silence, so dense and heavy that it seemed more powerful than any sound. And then, the auditorium exploded. It wasn't polite applause. It was a standing ovation. People stood up, one by one, clapping, many of them crying openly. They weren't applauding a student at a recital. They were applauding a truth they had just witnessed, a soul that had opened up in front of them through music. Leo opened his eyes, a little startled by the wave of sound coming toward him. He hadn't sought applause, but there it was. And for the first time, he understood that his color, his sound, wasn't just for him. It could touch others too, and that was his true victory. Not every voice needs to shout to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful voices are those that have sung only inside for a long time. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel the power of a voice that found its way, show your support. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel so that together we can continue to amplify the stories the world needs to hear. Someone, somewhere, may be in need of a little hope today.